Deep in the northern wilderness lies Frosthaven, a forgotten village buried under layers of ice and silence. For decades, it has remained isolated, cut off from the world by relentless blizzards and towering frost-covered mountains. The villagers live by strict, unspoken rules. Stay indoors after sunset, keep the lanterns lit, never speak of the visitors. When Dr. Evelyn Moore, a historian specializing in forgotten settlements, arrives to document the history of Frosthaven, she quickly realizes that the village holds far darker secrets than she expected. The villagers are afraid of the forest, the cold, and most of all, of what comes when the sun dips below the horizon. As the nights grow colder and the shadows grow longer, Evelyn must unravel the truth behind the village's curse before the frost consumes her too. The road to Frosthaven was little more than a jagged scar cut through an expanse of white. Snow piled high on either side of Evelyn's rented SUV, and the icy wind rattled the windows with sharp, ghostly fingers. The journey had been grueling, hours of slow driving through treacherous mountain paths, with her phone long out of service in the nearest town miles behind her. The sun was already beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains when she finally spotted it. Frosthaven, a cluster of ancient wooden houses huddled together at the base of a frozen hill, smoke curling weakly from crooked chimneys. Lanterns glowed faintly along narrow paths, their flickering light barely holding back the creeping shadows of dusk. Evelyn parked her SUV near what appeared to be a village square, a wide, snow-covered space with a frozen fountain at its center. She stepped out, her boots crunching against the ice-packed ground, and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. The cold was relentless, biting through her layers and clawing at her exposed skin. "Dr. Moore?" The voice came from an elderly man standing by one of the lantern posts. His face was weathered, his beard frosted with ice, and his narrow eyes watched her warily. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Moore." "You must be Elias." The man nodded slowly. "You shouldn't have come here, Doctor." His voice was low, heavy with something between exhaustion and fear. Elias led Evelyn through the narrow paths of Frosthaven, the lanterns casting long, dancing shadows across the snow. The villagers they passed stared at her from behind heavy curtains and frost-covered windows, their faces pale and hollow. "They don't see many outsiders here, do they?" Evelyn asked softly. "No," Elias said, "and for good reason." They arrived at a modest wooden lodge on the edge of the village. Inside, a fire crackled weakly in a stone hearth, and faded tapestries hung along the walls. Elias gestured to a wooden chair by the fire. "Warm yourself, Doctor. The nights here, they're long and unforgiving." Evelyn set her bag down and removed her gloves, rubbing her hands together in front of the fire. The heat felt fleeting, fragile against the oppressive cold seeping through the wooden walls. "I'm here to document the history of Frosthaven," Evelyn said carefully, "to understand why a place like this has remained so isolated for so long." Elias sighed deeply, staring into the fire. "Some histories are best left buried in the snow, Doctor. There are things you cannot understand, things you shouldn't want to understand." Before Evelyn could respond, a distant sound cut through the silence, a faint, melodic humming drifting in on the wind. It wasn't a song, it wasn't music, it was, something else. Elias froze, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "Close the shutters. Now," he hissed. Evelyn hesitated, but the look in Elias's eyes made her move. She rushed to the windows, pulling heavy curtains shut and securing the wooden latches. The humming grew louder. Closer. Outside, the lanterns flickered, and then everything went silent. Elias sat stiffly in his chair, his head bowed slightly, as if listening for something. Evelyn stayed frozen by the window, her breath shallow. "What was that?" she whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. "The visitors." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Who are they?" Elias didn't answer. He simply gestured to the fire. "Keep it burning, Doctor. Whatever happens, don't let the fire die." Evelyn stayed by the hearth, her eyes flicking to the shadows in the corners of the room. The silence pressed heavily against her ears, like she was trapped underwater. Somewhere outside, faint footsteps crunched in the snow. They weren't hurried, they weren't panicked, they were deliberate. Slow. Step, step, step. The sound circled the lodge once, twice, before fading into the distance. Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. They're gone. For now. Evelyn swallowed hard. What are they? What do they want? Elias finally looked up at her, his pale eyes filled with a fear so deep it seemed to have hollowed him out. They want warmth, Doctor. They want life. And they take it, one way or another. The following morning, Evelyn stepped out of the lodge into the pale gray light of dawn. The village square was silent, the snow untouched except for faint footprints leading into the woods at the edge of the village. The villagers avoided her gaze as they shuffled about their morning routines. Children were ushered indoors, lanterns were cleaned and refueled, but no one spoke of the night before. Evelyn approached Elias, who was inspecting one of the lantern posts with a shaky hand. "What happens if the lanterns go out?" she asked. Elias didn't look up. "The same thing that happens if the fire dies, in the hearth. They come." He turned to face her, his voice trembling. "You wanted history, Dr. Moore. You wanted to know the truth about Frosthaven. Tonight, after sunset, meet me at the old church at the edge of the village. I'll show you where it all began." The sky was growing darker again. Evelyn could already feel the cold deepening, like fingers curling around her chest. She nodded. As night began to fall, Evelyn made her way to the church. It was a skeletal structure of warped wood and cracked stone, perched on a slight hill overlooking the village. Lanterns hung from crooked posts outside, their light flickering weakly in the growing wind. Elias stood by the entrance, a lantern clutched tightly in his gloved hands. "Are you ready, Doctor?" he asked softly. Evelyn nodded, her breath visible in the icy air. The old wooden door creaked open as they stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of wax and mildew. Faded murals on the walls depicted scenes of cold forests, pale faces, and lanterns burning in the night. And at the far end of the church, beneath a shattered stained glass window, stood an altar carved from dark stone. In the center of the altar sat something small and fragile, a lantern with a flickering blue flame. Evelyn felt her chest tighten as she stared at it. "What is that?" she whispered. Elias's voice was low. "It's the beginning of everything, Dr. Moore, and it's the end." The flickering blue flame in the lantern cast ghostly shadows across the cracked stone altar. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, the cold biting into her exposed skin even inside the dim church. The faint hum of wind outside seemed to vibrate against the wooden walls, and the shadows in the corners of the room felt alive. Elias set his lantern down on a nearby pew and gestured toward the altar. "This is where it started," he said softly. "The lantern. The first lantern. It's older than Frosthaven itself. Older than any of us." Evelyn stepped closer, her boots echoing faintly on the stone floor. The lantern's glass was etched with strange symbols, its flame flickering weakly but steadily. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias let out a heavy sigh, his pale eyes fixed on the lantern. "A bargain. A terrible, desperate bargain. Long ago, when the first settlers arrived in this valley, the winters were harsher than they could have imagined. Crops died, livestock froze in the fields, people starved." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And then they came." "The visitors?" Evelyn asked. Elias nodded slowly. "They promised warmth, safety, a light to guide us through the endless dark. But the bargain had a cost, as these bargains always do. Evelyn's gaze remained locked on the lantern. What was the cost? Elias's shoulders sagged. Every winter, a price must be paid, a life freely given. If the price isn't paid, the lantern dims, and the shadows come closer. They hunger, Dr. Moore. They hunger for us. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind racing as the pieces began to fall into place. The isolated village, the fear in the villagers' eyes, the desperate maintenance of the lanterns scattered through the streets. It was all tied to this. A sacrifice? Evelyn whispered. You're saying the villagers willingly give someone to them every winter? Elias flinched, his hands trembling as he clenched them into fists. It's not always someone willing. Sometimes it's someone chosen. The weight of his words pressed against Evelyn's chest. How long has this been going on? Generations, Elias said. The visitors come with the first frost, and they stay until the thaw. But lately, something's changed. The cold is spreading faster, the lanterns are growing weaker, and the visitors are hungrier. Evelyn turned back to the altar, her eyes scanning the strange runes carved into the stone. Is there any way to stop it? Elias hesitated before answering. There's an old story, a way to break the bargain, but it's dangerous, and it's never been tried. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice firm. Tell me. Elias lowered his voice to a whisper. The lantern must be taken back to the forest, to the place where the bargain was made. The flame must be extinguished there. Evelyn frowned. Why hasn't anyone tried it before? Elias looked away. Because no one who goes into the forest at night ever comes back. Later that evening, Evelyn returned to her small lodge room, her mind spinning with Elias's words. Outside, the lanterns lining the narrow streets flickered weakly against the encroaching dark. She sat by the fire, the journal she'd been keeping open on her lap. Her notes were scattered across the table, filled with fragmented thoughts, theories, and questions. The lantern, the bargain, the visitors. The village was dying under the weight of this curse, and the villagers were trapped, held hostage by an unbreakable cycle of fear and survival. But someone had to try. She stared into the fire, her decision solidifying in the pit of her stomach. She would take the lantern into the forest. The next morning, Evelyn found Elias in the square, inspecting one of the lantern posts with shaky hands. I'm going to the forest, she said firmly. Elias froze, his back straightening slowly. You can't. It's suicide. It's the only way to break this cycle, Evelyn said. You said it yourself. The lantern must be taken back to the place where the bargain was made. If we don't try, this village is doomed. Elias's face was etched with fear and something else. Guilt. If you go, Dr. Moore, you'll be alone out there. No one will follow you. I understand. Elias hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small brass key. This will open the lantern's case, he said softly. Once you reach the forest's heart, you'll need to extinguish the flame with your own breath. But know this, the visitors won't let you do it easily. Evelyn took the key, her hand trembling slightly. Thank you, Elias. He didn't respond, only turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Evelyn prepared carefully. She packed warm clothes, extra lantern oil, and a small satchel filled with provisions. But most importantly, she carried the first lantern, its flickering blue flame casting faint shadows across her face. As night began to fall, Evelyn stood at the edge of the village, staring into the dense tree line of the forest. The shadows between the trunks stretched out like skeletal fingers, and the wind carried faint melodic whispers. The villagers watched her from a distance, their faces pale and hollow. No one tried to stop her. No one spoke. With one final breath, Evelyn stepped into the forest. The trees closed around her like a prison. The faint light of her lantern illuminated frost-covered branches and twisted roots that clawed at the snow. The whispers grew louder. "Turn back. Stay with us. The cold is so warm." Evelyn forced herself to keep walking, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The lantern swayed in her hand, its blue flame steady but faint. Hours seemed to pass as she made her way deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker. She felt eyes watching her from every direction, eyes she couldn't see, but could feel. Then she heard it, a low growl, deep, rumbling. She froze, her lantern trembling in her hand. From the shadows, something stepped forward, a shape taller than any man, with limbs elongated and skin stretched thin over sharp bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth split into a wide, jagged grin. A visitor. It didn't move closer, but it didn't step back either. It simply watched her, its head tilting slightly. Evelyn took a shaky step forward, the lantern's light flickering against the creature's gaunt face. The visitor hissed, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. But it didn't stop her. She walked past it, her breath hitching with every step, until the creature faded back into the shadows. She was close now. The forest had grown unnaturally still. The wind had stopped. The whispers had gone silent. And up ahead, faintly illuminated by the lantern's light, she saw it. A stone altar, covered in frost and etched with ancient runes. The place where it all began. The stone altar stood silent and imposing in the clearing, its surface coated in a thin layer of frost that glittered in the pale glow of Evelyn's lantern. Strange runes, carved deep into the stone, seemed to pulse faintly as if alive. The forest around her was utterly still. No wind, no whispers, only the weight of ancient secrets pressing against her chest. Evelyn stepped forward cautiously, her boots crunching softly against the frozen snow. Her breath fogged in the cold air, and her knuckles were white as she gripped the first lantern tightly. This was it. The place where it had all begun. She knelt beside the altar and set the lantern down gently on its surface. Its faint blue flame flickered, casting eerie shadows across the ancient runes. "Is this what you wanted?" Evelyn whispered into the cold void. "Is this what you demanded from them?" The forest didn't answer, but the silence felt expectant. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small brass key Elias had given her. Her fingers trembled as she brought it to the lantern's lock. Extinguish the flame at the source. The moment the key clicked into place, the forest exhaled. A low, guttural sound, part growl, part moan, rolled through the trees. The shadows shifted, writhing and coiling like living things. From the corners of her vision, Evelyn saw shapes emerging from the darkness. The visitors were coming. She turned sharply, her lantern trembling in her hand. The figures stepped into the faint glow of the lantern. Tall, skeletal shapes, cloaked in what looked like tattered sheets of frost and shadow. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their fingers tapering into sharp, claw-like points. And their faces. Hollow, sunken pits where eyes should be, and mouths stretched impossibly wide into frozen grins. Evelyn took a step back, her foot slipping slightly on the ice. The visitors surrounded the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on the first lantern atop the altar. They didn't move closer, but they didn't retreat either. They were waiting. Evelyn realized then, they weren't stopping her. They were watching her, waiting to see if she would finish what she had started. Her pulse thundered in her ears. As she turned back to the lantern, the brass key glinted faintly in the pale light. She hesitated. The flame inside the lantern flickered weakly, almost as if it, too, was afraid of what came next. "Please," Evelyn whispered. "Please let this work." She turned the key, the latch clicked open, and the lantern's glass panel swung outward with a faint creak. The cold wind rushed in immediately, causing the flame to sputter violently. Evelyn leaned forward, her face inches from the flickering light. She drew in a sharp breath and blew. The flame extinguished instantly, leaving only darkness. The clearing fell into silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Evelyn stayed frozen in place, her hands clutching the sides of the altar as her eyes adjusted to the pitch blackness around her. But the silence didn't last. A sound, low, echoing, and distant, began to rise from the earth itself. It was not a sound made by human or animal. It was something ancient, something hollow and vast. The visitors began to move. Their elongated bodies glided forward, closing the circle around Evelyn and the altar. Their faces twisted and contorted, their hollow mouths opening wider and wider until it seemed their heads might split apart. The earth beneath the altar began to crack. Frost spread outward from its base, radiating like jagged veins across the snow. "No," Evelyn whispered, stepping back. "No, no, no." The visitors threw their heads back and let out a piercing, unearthly scream, a sound so sharp and terrible that Evelyn's knees buckled and she fell to the frozen ground. The cracks in the altar deepened, and from within its core, a sickly blue light began to glow. The lantern's flame wasn't gone. It had moved. And now, it was waking up something far worse. The clearing erupted in chaos. The wind roared, the ground trembled, and the visitors shrieked and scattered like smoke on the wind. Evelyn shielded her eyes as the sickly blue light poured upward from the cracks in the stone, forming swirling, ghostly shapes in the air. And then, it spoke. A voice, deep, resonant, and ancient, echoed in her mind, vibrating through her bones. "Who disturbs our pact?" Evelyn's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She choked. "I came to end it. To stop this. You cannot stop what was willingly given." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the frozen ground and cutting through the howling wind. "The lantern is our vessel, the village is our tithe, and you are our messenger." Evelyn shook her head violently. No, I didn't." The light from the altar flared violently, blinding her. When Evelyn's vision cleared, she was lying on her back in the snow. The forest was silent again, and the altar was dark. The lantern was shattered, its brass casing twisted and broken. The visitors were gone. Evelyn forced herself to sit up, her body trembling uncontrollably from the cold and the aftermath of whatever had just happened. The forest was still, but it wasn't empty. She felt it. The presence, still watching her from the shadows. Slowly she rose to her feet. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she scanned the clearing. And then, from far away, back toward the village, she heard it. The faint tolling of a bell. It was soft but insistent. Evelyn turned and began to run. The village square was in chaos when Evelyn arrived. The lanterns along the pathways were flickering weakly, their light dim and sputtering. The villagers were gathered in the square, huddled together in fear. Children cried, mothers clutched them tightly, and Elias stood at the front, his face pale and hollow. "What did you do?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn staggered to a stop, her hair plastered to her face with sweat and frost. I tried to stop it. I tried to end it." Elias's shoulders sagged. "You've woken it, Dr. Moore. You've woken them." The bell in the chapel tolled again, louder this time. From the edge of the village, the forest had begun to change. The trees were moving. Their branches twisted unnaturally, and deep shadows spread across the snow, creeping forward like ink spilled in water. The visitors were coming. But this time, they weren't hiding in the shadows. They were marching. The villagers screamed as the lanterns along the paths began to go out, one by one. Evelyn clutched Elias's arm. "What do we do now?" Elias turned toward the chapel, his eyes wide with terror. We pray, Dr. Moore, and we run. The village square was chaos. The lanterns sputtered and died one by one, their faint golden glow swallowed by the encroaching shadows spilling from the forest. The tolling of the chapel bell echoed across Frosthaven, each note trembling with urgency, like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. Evelyn clutched Elias's arm, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Around them, villagers huddled together, their faces etched with fear and resignation. Mothers clutched their children, and fathers whispered final prayers. The forest at the village's edge was no longer still. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches clawing at the sky as the dark shapes of the visitors began to emerge. Tall, skeletal figures with hollow faces and gaping mouths, their bodies cloaked in frost and shadow. The air felt electric, buzzing with a force older than the stones beneath Frosthaven. Elias turned to Evelyn, his voice low but urgent. We must get to the chapel. The light from the altar. It's our only chance now. Evelyn nodded, clutching the shattered remains of the first lantern close to her chest. Go, Elias shouted. They ran. The chapel doors slammed shut behind them, the heavy wood vibrating under the force of the wind outside. Elias bolted the door as Evelyn stumbled forward, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The interior of the chapel was dim, the stained glass windows casting fractured light across the pews and altar. The faint remnants of the lantern's flame still glowed on the altar, casting weak, flickering shadows. Around them, the faint whispers of the visitors drifted in from outside. Open the door. Let us in. The cold is so warm. Evelyn gripped the edge of the altar, her voice trembling. They're coming. What do we do, Elias? What do we do now? Elias stared at the faint blue glow on the altar, his face pale and hollow-eyed. This light is all that's holding them back, but it's fading, and once it's gone, so are we. Evelyn pulled the tattered journal from her bag, flipping through its brittle pages. The ink was smeared in places, the handwriting frantic and uneven. There has to be something, she muttered, some clue, some way to stop them. Her eyes landed on a passage, scribbled near the end of the book. The light must return to the earth. The flame must be fed, not extinguished. Only then will the bargain end. Evelyn's voice trembled as she read the words aloud. The flame must be fed, not extinguished. Elias's brow furrowed. Fed? What does that mean? Evelyn closed her eyes, the truth settling over her like frost on bare skin. It means a sacrifice, a life. Outside, the sound of cracking wood and splintering glass echoed through the frozen air. The visitors were closer now, their elongated forms twisting in the shadows as they moved toward the chapel. Inside, the glow on the altar was flickering, growing fainter with every passing second. Evelyn turned to Elias, her voice sharp with urgency. The flame needs a life. It needs someone willing to feed it, to offer themselves. Elias's face crumbled, his expression hollow. That's impossible. Who could? A faint voice interrupted him. I'll do it. Both Evelyn and Elias turned sharply. Standing near the back of the chapel was a young girl, no older than 10. Her pale hair framed her fragile face, and her eyes, though wide with fear, were steady. Her name was Lena. No, Evelyn said immediately. Absolutely not. But Lena stepped forward, clutching a small lantern of her own, its flame flickering weakly inside. The shadows took my brother, my mother. I don't want to see anyone else taken. Elias turned away, his shoulders trembling. Evelyn knelt before Lena, her voice soft but firm. There has to be another way. There must be. But Lena shook her head. The light needs me. It's the only way, isn't it? Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she pulled Lena into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry. The girl nodded, her small hands trembling as she approached the altar, The storm outside intensified, the wind screaming against the chapel walls. The visitors were at the windows now, their hollow faces pressed against the stained glass, their sharp claws scraping against the stone walls. Lena climbed onto the altar, her small lantern clutched to her chest. Evelyn held her breath as the girl knelt beside the fading blue flame. "I'm not afraid," Lena whispered. The light on the altar flared suddenly, the blue glow growing brighter, stronger. The shadows in the chapel recoiled, hissing and twisting violently. The light enveloped Lena, casting her silhouette against the stone walls. Her fragile voice carried through the air, soft and steady. "Let the light guide them home." The flame burst upward in a blinding flash, consuming the altar, the chapel, and everything within its reach. Evelyn shielded her eyes as the force of the light knocked her backward. The walls of the chapel groaned, the stained glass shattered, and the sound of the visitors shrieking in agony filled the air. When the light faded, Evelyn opened her eyes. The chapel was silent. The stained glass windows were shattered, their shards glittering on the stone floor. The altar was empty now, its stone surface cold and still. Lena was gone. Outside, the village square was illuminated by a soft golden glow. The lanterns along the paths were burning brightly again, their flames steady and unwavering. The forest at the edge of the village was still. The shadows had retreated, leaving only the faint sound of the wind rustling the branches. Elias helped Evelyn to her feet, his face streaked with tears. "She did it. She saved us." Evelyn's voice trembled. But at what cost? The villagers emerged slowly from their homes, their faces pale and tired, but filled with cautious hope. The air was no longer heavy with dread, and the forest no longer watched with hungry eyes. But the cost was carved into their hearts. Lena was gone. Her small lantern sat on the steps of the chapel, its flame glowing faintly in the pale dawn light. Evelyn knelt beside it, her breath catching in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. From somewhere deep in the forest, a faint sound carried on the wind, a single melodic hum. But this time it wasn't cold, it wasn't cruel, it was peaceful. The sun had begun to rise over Frosthaven, casting faint golden light across the snow-draped rooftops. The village, so long cloaked in the suffocating grip of fear and shadow, now sat still and quiet. The lanterns lining the narrow paths burned steadily, their flames unwavering for the first time in years. Evelyn knelt in the snow before Lena's lantern, her gloved fingers trembling as they hovered over the delicate glass. The faint golden flame inside flickered softly, almost as if it recognized her presence. Behind her, the villagers gathered in silence. Parents held their children tightly, men removed their hats, and elderly women clutched rosaries in trembling hands. Among them stood Elias, his face streaked with tears, his shoulders weighed down by grief and gratitude. "She was just a child," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking. Elias stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "She was braver than any of us, and because of her, we're still here." The wind swept softly through the village square, carrying with it the faintest scent of pine and smoke. For the first time since Evelyn had arrived, the air no longer felt heavy with dread, but the weight in her chest remained. That afternoon, the villagers gathered in the chapel. The broken stained glass had been swept away, and candles had been lit across the stone altar. Lena's small lantern sat at the center, its golden flame glowing like a star in the gathering twilight. Evelyn stood at the back, her arms crossed over her chest. She couldn't shake the image of Lena's fragile silhouette kneeling before the altar, her pale face illuminated by the flickering blue flame. Elias stepped up to address the crowd, his voice carrying across the chapel. "The curse has been lifted. The lanterns are steady, the visitors have retreated, and the forest is quiet once more." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the villagers. "But let us never forget the price that was paid. Lena gave us something we could never repay, a chance to breathe, to live, to wake without fear. We owe it to her to honor this peace, to keep the lanterns lit, and to remember her sacrifice." The crowd murmured soft prayers, their faces etched with solemn respect. Evelyn turned away, stepping out into the cold air. She needed to leave. That night, Evelyn sat in her small lodge room, her suitcase packed at her feet. The journal lay open on the table, the pages filled with frantic notes, ancient runes, and fragmented entries from Matron Eleanor's desperate writings. But now, the story was finished. The forest was silent. The visitors had retreated. She stood by the window, staring out at the village square. The lanterns burned brightly, their golden light pooling onto the snow-covered ground. Lena's lantern still sat on the chapel steps, glowing softly against the dark backdrop of the night. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. The shadows were gone, yes, but the forest still stood at the edge of Frosthaven. Its towering pines loomed like silent sentinels, and its branches creaked softly in the cold wind. Something ancient had been bound there, contained but not destroyed. And some bargains, Evelyn realized, were never truly broken. At dawn, Evelyn loaded her suitcase into her SUV and turned back to look at the village one last time. Elias stood nearby, his weathered face drawn and tired. "Are you sure you won't stay a little longer?" he asked. Evelyn shook her head. "I've done all I can here, Elias. The rest is up to you and the villagers now." Elias nodded slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "You gave us hope, Dr. Moore, and you reminded us of what it means to fight back, to protect what matters." Evelyn offered him a faint smile before climbing into her car. As she drove away, Frosthaven began to disappear behind her, swallowed by the pale morning mist. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror, Evelyn thought she saw something, just for a moment. A faint figure standing at the edge of the forest, small, frail. It was Lena. Her lantern glowed softly in her hands as she watched Evelyn disappear into the fog. Months later, Evelyn sat at her desk in her warm, book-lined apartment. The battered journal from Frosthaven lay open before her, its pages carefully preserved. Beside it sat Lena's small lantern, now extinguished but still intact. She had tried to move on, but Frosthaven clung to her like frost to glass. Every night she dreamed of the forest, of the altar, of shadows moving just out of sight. Her phone buzzed. A notification. It was an email from Elias. Subject: "The lanterns still burn. Body." "The snow has returned, but the lanterns hold steady. The forest is still quiet, and the children laugh in the square once again. But Dr. Moore, something feels different. The wind carries whispers, faint and fleeting. We will keep the lights burning, just as Lena would have wanted. Thank you for everything. Elias." Evelyn exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the small lantern on her desk. For a moment, she swore she saw its glass flicker. But when she blinked, it was still. 1 year later. The village of Frosthaven stood blanketed in white, its lanterns glowing like stars against the endless expanse of snow. But something was changing. At the edge of the forest, where the trees twisted into jagged shapes, faint shadows began to stir. Their shapes were tall and skeletal, their hollow faces barely visible in the dim light. The lanterns in the village flickered briefly, their flames trembling as though uncertain. And far in the distance, deep in the woods, a faint humming began again. Soft, melodic, and impossibly ancient. The cold wind carried it toward Frosthaven. The snow began to fall heavier, and the shadows began to move.